The wind that howled through the valleys of Wales in 1883 carried more than cold. It carried secrets, dark, buried truths that the world was never supposed to hear. The land itself seemed to resist speaking of it, as if the mountain swallowed every whisper before it could escape. From the outside, the villages looked harmless, stone cottages, fields of sheep, smoke rising from chimneys. But if you dare to look closer, past the mist and the church bells, you would find a house people pretended not to see. A house they called cursed. A house where blood ran in circles, where names repeated through generations, and where silence was the most dangerous sound of all. Imagine stepping inside that house. The air heavy, the walls damp. Children watching you from dark corners, their eyes strange, their voices uneven. They were not strangers to each other, and yet, none of them were truly separate. Family bound them so tightly it became a prison. Cousins marrying cousins, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces. Every attempt to preserve the bloodline only poisoned it further. And here's what chills me to the bone. Science turned away. Doctors refused to put it in writing. Newspapers avoided the word. The parish looked the other way. This wasn't just a family sin. It was a collective act of denial. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll see why this denial is the darkest part of the story. But let me not begin with the beginning, because nothing about this story runs in a straight line. Instead, let's start with the body. It was January of 1883 when a woman was found dead in her cottage, 33 years old, but her face looked like it belonged to someone twice her age. Her skin sagged, her jaw collapsed inward, her hands curled into claw-like shapes. The doctor's report said nothing unusual. Illness, poverty, malnutrition. That was all. But those who saw her spoke differently. They whispered of her crooked body, her distorted features, her clouded eyes. And they said the word no one dared to speak out loud: incest. Still, officially, it never happened. Officially, she was just another poor villager. That's how denial works. Bury it, forget it, and pretend it was never there. But she left behind 4 children. And here is where the story twists deeper into shadow. Neighbors reported hearing cries at night, sounds that didn't resemble children at all. They spoke of shapes moving behind the curtains, figures hunched, heads bent low. Yet when officials were asked about these children, no records were found. Baptisms, yes. Birth entries, yes. But after the mother's death, it's as if they vanished, erased. And ask yourself, who benefits from erasing children? Those who fear the truth. Those who cannot afford shame. Stay with me, because what's coming next is not just disturbing. It forces you to question your own silence. Let me pull you backwards. Before that woman was found dead, before the cries in the night. Go back decades, when the family line began to twist in on itself. Cousins marrying cousins. It wasn't strange here. It was expected. Family was everything. Outsiders were treated as threats. And so, generation after generation, the tree became a loop. You could not trace a branch without it leading back into itself. The first children born of these unions, perhaps they seemed fine, healthy enough to run in the fields, to herd sheep. But by the 3rd generation, something changed. The bodies weakened. The faces grew strange. Some children never spoke. Some never walked. And yet, the marriages continued. Because to break the cycle meant betraying the family. To marry outside meant polluting the bloodline. They thought they were preserving something. What they were really preserving was a curse. Here's where denial sharpens its blade. The church, whose duty was to guide, said nothing. Priests baptized the children, smiled at the parents, and moved on. Scientists, who should have studied and recorded, dismissed the stories as folklore. And the neighbors, oh, the neighbors. They whispered behind closed doors, but never once stepped in. Because to acknowledge it meant admitting that something monstrous was happening right under their noses. And no one wants to carry that weight. But silence kills. Imagine being one of those children, born into a house where your birth was already a mistake, knowing your body was marked by choices you never made. Imagine looking at your brothers and sisters and realizing they were also your cousins, your uncles, your nieces. Imagine hearing villagers outside your door laugh at stories of the cursed family, while you sat inside, unable to speak, unable to change your fate. Can you feel that? That crushing weight of hopelessness? That realization that you were trapped not by chains, but by blood? And this is why you must stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about the grotesque. It's about what silence does. It's about what happens when an entire society decides that denial is easier than truth. Let's jump forward again. A witness, a traveling clergyman, later wrote in a private letter, not a published one, because it would have been too scandalous, that he visited a Welsh valley in the 1880s where children bore the marks of their own ancestry upon their faces. He wrote of small, sunken chests, of slurred speech, of eyes that seemed clouded though the children were young. And he ended the letter with a line that chills me even now. It is a house where God himself has turned his gaze away. Why didn't he publish? Why didn't he expose it? Because shame is powerful. And in the Victorian age, family reputation mattered more than truth. The church could not afford the scandal. Science could not afford the embarrassment. And the family, well, family kept itself alive by swallowing its own pain. But you know what's worse? Even now, records are scarce. Ask historians, and they'll call it an unproven tale. Ask doctors, and they'll say the evidence isn't enough. But does lack of evidence erase suffering? Does denial erase the cries of children in the night? Or does it just bury them deeper, hoping no one digs them up? Let me rehook you here, because what I'm about to tell you is even more unsettling than what we've already uncovered. The villagers who whispered about the family also began to avoid their land, not because of disease, not because of poverty, but because they believed it was cursed. They believed even walking across the property could bring bad luck. And so, family became ghosts long before they died. Now picture this, generations later, when the house was finally abandoned and others dared to step inside, they found carvings on the walls, scratched words, scratched shapes, circles within circles, repeated names. Was it madness? Was it desperation? Or was it simply the reflection of a family that had no beginning and no end? And let me ask you, if you had stood there in 1883, what would you have done? Would you have walked into that house, spoken the truth, and risked exile? Or would you have turned away, like the others, telling yourself it was none of your business? Tell me in the comments, because your answer says more than you think. Don't look away yet, because I haven't told you the worst part. The worst part is that this story was erased. Historians avoided it. Scientists denied it. The village itself burned records, or so it's believed. Why? Because no one wanted Wales to be remembered for this. National pride smothered human suffering, and the victims, the children, were reduced to shadows, to whispers, to nothing more than folklore. But folklore is truth that refuses to die. Think about it. How many stories have you heard dismissed as myths, only for evidence to surface years later? How many times has denial rewritten history? And how many voices, real voices, have been silenced because they made people uncomfortable? This, my friends, is one of them. And I need you to stay with me, because the further we go, the darker it gets. You haven't yet heard about the graves, the unmarked stones, the rumors of bodies hidden in the ground, never blessed, never spoken over. You haven't yet heard about the family members who tried to escape, only to be dragged back into the circle. That's still to come. But let's pause here. Look at what we've uncovered already. A family so bound by its own bloodline that it collapsed inward. A community so terrified of shame that it buried the truth. A science so arrogant it denied what it didn't want to see. And children, innocent children, who became the price of that silence. Now tell me, what's your opinion? Should this story be remembered as fact, as a warning, as history? Or should it stay buried like the village wanted? I want to hear from you, because your voice, here and now, matters more than the silence that killed them. And please, don't leave yet, because when I tell you what came next, when I tell you how this story was nearly erased from history forever, you will not look at denial the same way again. The story did not end with that woman's body in 1883. No, her death was only the surface of something far older, far darker, and far more disturbing than anyone wanted to admit. And if you think what you've heard so far was the worst of it, I need you to stay with me, because what comes next will haunt you long after this video ends. Let's begin not with her, but with the ground beneath her. Years later, when locals tried to expand farmland near the cursed house, they unearthed something strange. Shallow graves, unmarked, bones small enough to belong to children, bones twisted in ways that suggested deformity. The villagers who found them didn't speak of it publicly. They covered the graves again. Why? Because to admit what lay beneath meant admitting the whispers were true. It meant exposing that this was not a single tragedy, but a pattern repeated across generations. And so again, silence won. But let's rewind. Before the graves, before the children vanished from the records, picture a Sunday morning in that valley. The chapel bell rings. Villagers file in, and among them, the family everyone pretended not to see. Heads lowered, children hidden behind shawls, mothers clutching hands too tightly, as if holding back the truth itself. The preacher speaks of sin and purity, while the very embodiment of corruption sits silently in the pews. And no one dares to call it out. That's the part that keeps me awake. The hypocrisy of it. How many sermons were spoken about morality, while the true rot sat right there, in front of everyone's eyes? Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely someone must have tried to stop it. Surely someone must have spoken up. But here's the truth. A few did. A handful of letters survive, written by outsiders who passed through the valley. They describe peculiar children, with faces marked by their kinship. They describe whispers of marriages so close they bordered on unspeakable. And do you know what happened to those letters? They were dismissed, called exaggerations, or worse, destroyed. Science, in the late 19th century, wanted progress, discovery, prestige. To publish a case of grotesque inbreeding in a poor Welsh village was not prestigious. It was scandalous. It wasn't the kind of story gentlemen scientists wanted to attach their names to. And so they denied it. They closed their eyes. And the children remained ghosts. But ghosts don't disappear. Let me bring you forward again, into the 20th century, when fragments of a story still lingered in the oral traditions of the valley. Families who swore they would never step foot near the cursed ground. Grandparents who hushed children when they asked about the strange ones. A whole culture of silence built on the backs of those who suffered. Isn't that the cruelest twist? That the victims became not only erased, but transformed into monsters in the tales told about them? And here's where it cuts deepest. Those children were never monsters. They were born into a cycle they never chose. Their suffering was not their fault. Yet history remembers them not as victims, but as warnings. Think about that. Let me rehook you, because the next detail is even harder to stomach. Some villagers claimed that when officials came to collect census data in 1881, they were instructed to leave certain names off the list. Entire households omitted. Children never counted. If true, this means the erasure wasn't just local gossip, it was systematic. A deliberate choice to hide the evidence. And once again, silence buried the truth. But ask yourself this. Why would so many people, from villagers to church leaders to scientists, work so hard to cover this up? Was it shame alone? Or was there something else? Here's a thought that might disturb you. What if this wasn't an isolated case? What if stories like this existed across Britain, across Europe, tucked into remote valleys and poor villages, erased before they could ever be studied? What if Wales was not an exception, but only one of the few places where whispers survived? Does that possibility make your stomach tighten the way it does mine? Now, let's circle back to that house. The cursed one. Generations lived and died there, never leaving its walls. Some said you could feel the weight as soon as you stepped inside. Scratched carvings on the wood, circles within circles, names repeating endlessly. Was it superstition, madness, or just a desperate attempt to make sense of a life with no escape? Imagine a child, no more than 7, tracing the same circle on the wall his father had drawn, not knowing it meant he was repeating the same fate. Imagine him scratching his own name beside the names of uncles, cousins, brothers, all of them looping into one another until individuality itself vanished. Can you feel the claustrophobia? The hopelessness of knowing you are trapped in bloodlines that only fold inward? Stay with me, because the story is about to fracture again. There are accounts, unverified but persistent, that some family members tried to break free. A girl who fell in love with a man from another valley. A boy who ran away to the coast. And yet both returned. Some say they were dragged back by force. Others say they returned willingly, terrified of the outside world that had mocked and rejected them. Either way, the circle never truly broke. The bloodline kept folding back into itself, tightening like a noose. And still science denied it. Let me pause and ask you something. If you had lived in that valley in 1883, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, knowing you might be cast out forever? Or would you have stayed silent, convincing yourself it wasn't your problem? Be honest with yourself. And tell me in the comments, because I think most of us, when pushed, would have chosen silence. And that's the most terrifying part of all. Because silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity. Now let's leap forward, past the house, past the graves, to the present. Why does this story still matter? Why does it still burn in the whispers of families who live near the valley even today? Because it's a reminder of what happens when denial becomes easier than truth. A reminder that history isn't just what's written in books. It's also what's buried in graves, what's erased from records, what's whispered in fear. Think about your own family history. How many stories have been silenced? How many truths buried because they were too shameful to admit? And what price was paid for that silence? I need you to stay until the end, because the final piece of this puzzle is the one most people never hear. The story of how the house itself was destroyed, not by nature, not by neglect, but deliberately burned down. Ashes scattered, stones dismantled, an attempt to erase it completely from the landscape. But fire doesn't erase memory. Fire only leaves scars. When the last of the family died, the house was left empty for years. Some said it was haunted. Some said you could still hear the cries of children at night. But eventually, villagers grew tired of its shadow. They tore it down, buried the remains, pretended it had never been there. And yet here we are, still speaking of it, still haunted by it, still asking why. So tell me, what do you believe? Do you think the story of the cursed family is truth, buried by shame? Or do you think it is folklore, exaggerated over time to scare children? Whatever your answer, remember this. Folklore begins somewhere, and silence always has a cost. And the cost here was children who never asked to be born, children who became shadows, children who carried the weight of choices they never made. Don't leave yet, because in the next part, I will take you deeper, into the very heart of denial itself, into the way history rewrites suffering, into the graves that still remain, unmarked, unnamed, waiting for someone to finally speak their truth. But before we move on, I need to know, how is this video for you? What do you feel when you hear about this? Anger? Sadness? Disbelief? Let me know in the comments, because your voice matters more than you realize. Your voice keeps this story alive. And remember this, silence killed them. Silence erased them. Don't let silence win again. The land remembers what people try to forget. Even now, the hills of Wales stand quiet, as though holding secrets in their stone hearts. If you walk the valley where the cursed house once stood, you won't see ruins. You won't see graves. You won't see anything at all. Just grass, sheep, the endless sky. But if you stop and listen, the silence feels different. It feels heavy. It feels like the kind of silence that has swallowed screams. This is where history betrayed them, because every official record says nothing unusual ever happened here. No scandal, no deformities, no cursed family, just ordinary villagers, ordinary lives. That is the official truth. But the unofficial truth, the whispers, the bones, the erased children, are far more powerful than anything written in ink. And isn't that strange? That the greatest horrors often survive not through records, but through the things people refuse to write down? But let me pull you somewhere else, far away from 1883, into the late 19th century world of science. This was the era of Darwin, of evolution, of progress. Scientists were obsessed with proving superiority, with mapping bloodlines, with showing how civilization triumphed over savagery. Do you think they wanted to admit that, in the heart of Britain, entire families were collapsing under the weight of their own blood? Of course not. It didn't fit their narrative, and so they denied it. They called it superstition, folklore, exaggeration. But denial does not erase truth. Let's circle back, because I need you to feel the weight of this. Picture the last surviving child of that house. Alone, after siblings and parents had died. The villagers said he wandered the fields, muttering to himself. Some said he couldn't speak clearly, only sounds half-formed. Others said he carried a piece of wood carved into circles, running his fingers over it endlessly. He died young, and they buried him quietly, without a name on the stone. And with his death, the bloodline ended. Or so they say. But did it truly end? Or did fragments scatter? Distant cousins, forgotten marriages, descendants who carried pieces of that cursed blood into other families? What if the line never really disappeared, but dissolved into the larger body of Wales? And if that's true, then what does it mean? That the silence succeeded? That denial worked? Or that the curse lives on, invisible, unnamed? Stay with me, because the scariest part is not that this happened, but that it was erased so well. Let's jump to the graves. The shallow, unmarked ones. Villagers told stories that when the ground was dug for farming, bones would appear. Small bones, twisted, fragile. They reburied them quickly, refusing to call a priest, refusing to leave a marker. Even the earth became complicit in silence. But soil doesn't lie. Bones don't vanish. And if you were to dig today, what would you find? Think about that. But let's move again, this time into the minds of the neighbors. What must it have been like to live beside that house? To see children you knew were suffering and say nothing? To hear cries in the night and turn away? Some must have felt guilt. Some must have felt disgust. And yet, they all agreed on one thing. Silence was easier. Shame could not be spoken. And so, silence became law. Now, here's a question I want you to sit with. What's more monstrous? The family who closed itself in, generation after generation, or the community who let happen, who refused to intervene, who chose denial over truth? Tell me what you think, because I'm not sure which answer frightens me more. Rehook here, because what I'm about to tell you may change the way you see this entire story. In 1883, the same year that woman was found dead, there were newspapers reporting on curiosities of rural Wales, oddities of speech, of behavior, of appearance, never directly naming the family, never directly pointing to incest, but hinting, circling around it. And then, suddenly, those reports stopped. Why? Did pressure come from church leaders? Did the parish demand silence? Or did editors decide that Wales, already struggling with its reputation as a poor, backward land, couldn't afford another stain? Whatever the reason, the silence deepened. And so we are left not with clarity, but with shadows. But sometimes shadows are enough. Now imagine this. A child born into that family, growing up in a house where names loop endlessly, where every story ends where it began. Do you think they even understood what was happening? Or did they believe the whole world lived this way? Did they think everyone's uncle was also their cousin? Everyone's brother also their father's brother? How do you comprehend a world beyond the circle if you've never seen it? That's the tragedy. They weren't only prisoners of blood, they were prisoners of knowledge. And no one came to free them. Let me take you further back, before the house was ever cursed, to the first choice. The first cousin who married another cousin. Did they know what they were beginning? Did they feel shame? Or did they feel pride, believing they were keeping the family strong, pure, untainted by outsiders? That first decision set the path for everything that followed. A single choice that rippled through generations, turning pride into deformity, love into suffering, family into prison. And doesn't that make you wonder, what choices are we making now, in our own time, that will ripple forward unseen, until it's too late? This story is not just about 1883. It's about us. It's about the power of silence, the danger of denial, the cost of shame. Now let me take you to the fire, the destruction of the house. It happened quietly. No grand announcement. No official record. Just whispers that villagers grew tired of its shadow. They pulled down the stones, scattered the ashes, let grass swallow the ground. They thought they were erasing history. But erasure only works if no one remembers. And here we are, remembering. Do you feel the weight of that? That by speaking their names, even in fragments, we undo the silence that killed them? That by watching this video to the end, you are resisting the very denial that erased them? This is why you must stay with me. Because if you leave now, the silence wins again. Let me pause and ask, what do you think of all this? Do you believe it's truth, buried by shame? Do you believe it's myth, twisted into legend? Or do you think it's something in between, truth so disturbing it could only survive as whispers? Tell me what you believe. Your opinion is not just commentary. It's part of keeping this story alive. And I want you to think about something else. This wasn't the only place in history where families collapsed under their own bloodlines. We know of royal houses plagued by genetic curses. We know of remote villages with whispered deformities. But the difference is this: those were recorded. This was erased. That is why it matters. Because forgotten suffering is the cruelest suffering of all. So let me end with this thought. Maybe the real curse wasn't the bloodline at all. Maybe the real curse was silence. A silence that allowed it to happen. A silence that buried the victims. A silence that denied the truth. And that silence stretched from 1883 all the way to today. Until you heard this story. Now the silence is broken. And I leave you with this question. What will you do with it? Will you let it fade again? Become just another dark tale you scroll past? Or will you carry it, remember it, speak it, so that denial no longer has the final word? The land remembers. The bones remember. And now you remember too. So tell me, what's your opinion? Was this truly the most inbred case denied by science? Or was it a legend that holds a deeper truth about shame, pride, and silence? Leave your thoughts below. Because in speaking them, you're giving voice to those who never had one. And thank you. Thank you for staying with me through the end. Because it's only by staying, by listening, by refusing to look away, that we keep the silence from winning.